Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and where we share information and real-world experience from the front lines of sustainability to inspire collaboration and action. With me, Nigel Lake, here in New York, and my co-host Paul Herman in Paris. Today we have our regular Green Jobs Report, where we take a particular look in keeping with the time of the year and the Juneteenth the Juneteenth reminder in the US, the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion will be an important part of this discussion. And we also have a special report on Stockholm+50 and what lies ahead with special guest Alex Rafalovitz, who's joining us from Bogota, Colombia today, and Claudia Campero Arena, who's in Mexico City, both from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Organization. Just by way of a very brief introduction, we are clearly in a really unusual environment now, but not one that is unprecedented. There is significant inflation in many economies, and this is really putting pressure on some of the fundamentals of life, food prices and energy prices, and indeed housing and education and healthcare too. We're seeing around the world traditional responses to that environment, interest rates being increased, here in the US and other countries around the world. I know I was looking at Brazil earlier this week, and interest rates there are now over 13%, which is a dramatic increase on a couple of years ago. Some governments are also flirting with investment in infrastructure and in other measures that might actually go to the heart of the problems, a very different response from what has traditionally been done, but there is a lot of nervousness around whether that will work or whether governments and central banks should stick to just putting the interest rates up. So with that as introduction, let me hand over to Paul Herman and to Amir Khalegi to take us into our Green Jobs Report. Over to you, Paul.
Great, thank you, Nigel. Welcome everybody to ESGX Live. Glad to have you here on Zoom and on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, please hit the like button and feel free to share with others. This is being recorded today, as all of our 73 ESGXs to date. So if you want to learn more about sustainability, green jobs, climate action, the bioeconomy, and other important topics, check out esgx.org. All right, Amir, yesterday was the Juneteenth holiday here in the US. It's the celebration of the end of slavery, primarily for Black and African Americans. And we also are reviewing this month's jobs report. So highly curious to hear on both of those fronts, what's the latest in green jobs? And when we look at Black and African American employment, what's happening there?
Perfect. Yeah, get really excited for this month's report. A lot of very impactful information getting out. So why don't we get to it? I'm going to share my screen. So for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, first off, welcome, and hope you guys stick around for our monthly report and continue to show up and see how our report has developed. Our report has been going on now for around like 2.5 years, and it provides data-driven insights on the outcomes and potential outcomes of greening the jobs within the economy. The way that we do our impact analysis is through HIP, or Human Impact Plus Profit Rating, Human Impact Plus Profit Rating, which looks at 7 HIP pillars on health, wealth, earth, equality, trust, products and services, and management practices. These pillar metrics are associated with over 2,000 US companies for our sample size. HIP itself rates over 10,000, 20,000 companies worldwide, but for the United States, we use our analytics of over 2,000 companies. These companies are linked to various industries, and we cross-map these companies to their respective industries and then overlay that information, that HIP information, to government data sources such as the current unemployment statistics survey or the current population survey, which has information on employment, wages, and diversity, as we'll see at the end of our report this month. As we rate these industries, they are given a weighted industry HIP rating, which places companies and industries within 3 respective buckets: green, slightly extractive, and extractive. If we look at the top right, we can see some example industries that are found within the green industry bucket, the slightly extractive, and then extractive as well. Overall, we see that greener industries are more resilient to job loss while also paying more, regardless of what data source that we look at or what cut that we do. These are the reoccurring themes that we've come to over the past 2.5 years of our analysis. Our analysis started around, Our analysis started around COVID-19 and provided like a base mark of the resiliency of greener versus slightly extractive and extractive industries. At the peak of the COVID-19 crisis, we see that extractive industries had a peak loss of around 35%, whereas green industries peaked out at around 9.3%. Now, unemployment, as we go, we see that greener industries are still at the lowest unemployment rate, while extractive industries are displaying the highest unemployment rate when compared to all other industry buckets. Again, to note, this is using the current population survey, which differs from the current employment statistics survey on the basis of how individuals are surveyed or are questioned. In the current population survey, it's surveyed at the household level, whereas the current unemployment statistics survey or the current employment statistics survey is surveyed at the firm level. So we can see here that when looking at the cumulative percent difference of the February 2020 employment level, that extractive industries suffered a very large loss of around 18% of its total employment base, whereas green industries suffered around that 9%, 8% range. To date, when looking at April data, and the reason why we are looking at April data is because we take a granular analysis of over 200 industries, and that detailed data is only released 2 months back by the BLS. So when looking at the most recent numbers, we can see that greener industries was the first to pass the threshold of the February 2020 employment level for that given bucket, whereas slightly extractive and extractive industries are still lagging behind and below their past February 2020 employment level. What we're looking at here now is the estimated annualized wages per industry bucket. And we can see that there is a significant difference in regard to pay when comparing green industries versus extractive industries, a difference of almost 35,000. Along with that, we calculate these annualized earnings using the average hourly earnings, but also the average weekly hours worked. And greener industries, along with having the highest hourly pay, also had the most stable hours, averaging around 36, indicating full-time employment. Whereas extractive industries averaged around 30 hours a week, pointing towards more gig-related and part-time work. Just something to be noted. We can also see that while also having the highest annualized wages, greener industries over the past decade has also had the highest wage growth in comparison to green, slightly extractive, and extractive industries. Rounding up, there's around a 50% increase in the annualized wage for green industries, whereas since 2010, and on average, extractive industries has increased by 36%, a difference of around 13%. When looking at the hipness of the economy, we can see that, unfortunately, when we look at this, as unemployment went up, indicated by the dashed line, the hipness of the economy actually went up. And what that tells us is that the jobs that were being dropped off of the economy, or the jobs that were lost or destroyed, were proportionally more extractive jobs. Thus, when we calculate the greenness and the hipness of the economy, it actually went up because it was more likely that extractive jobs were lost during recessionary times, like COVID or like the 2008 crisis. So that is a trend that during recession crisis times, more extractive industries are more likely to experience job loss. So this is actually concluding our routine portion of the analysis. And as said from Nigel and Paul, in the United States, we are celebrating, the independence from slavery, and have tones of doing analytics on the diversity found within green industries, extractive industries, and slightly extractive industries. So what we're looking at here, and Paul, feel free to jump in whenever, whenever you'd like, but we can see here that within green industries, in terms of gender diversity, in terms of diversity among Black or African American, it has the highest proportion of workers of a different gender than male and of a different gender than white as well. And as we get more extractive, those proportions actually become less when compared to green and extractive. Anything to add for this graph?
I want to say this is something to celebrate, that sustainability for employees is higher in the Black community. It's not for all people who are working in all of those companies, but it's good news both for women and for Black and African Americans, that there's a higher proportion in more sustainable companies. And those sustainable companies probably are purposely ensuring some higher diversity and not applying some of the tendencies that can propagate in society. So let's look a little bit deeper, Amir.
So we have a detailed breakdown looking at this table here of our industry groupings. These industry groupings, to provide context, if we were to break these industries down into a detailed data, which is our more formal and routine analysis, these industries that you see featured here would break down into around 194 sub-industries. So these are roll-ups of the more minor groups into major industry groups. And what we can see here is that for greener industries, in general, they are more diverse when compared to slightly extractive and extractive. And more notably, with this analysis, we were able to advance ourselves by able to parse out for-profit and not-for-profit / government entities in the industry groups of education and hospitals. And we can see that, diversity with women in these greener industries and educational services were, more proportion towards women, and a higher proportion relative to the Black or African American diversity metric as well.
And you can see some low ratios in mining and construction. And some of those jobs are higher paid. So in a future episode, we'll look at the pay. We will try and evaluate the pay for some of these jobs. But you can see that in hospitals, especially in skilled nursing, in psychiatric care, as well as teachers in government or nonprofit school districts, the people who might operate the administration in your city. And we'll talk about cities in a few moments. We talk about the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty because there's 50 cities who have signed up. And then in transportation and warehousing, there's a lot of transportation diversity.
Right.
All right, Amir, let's look at the next two and wrap up.
Perfect. So as we can see here, these are the minor groups as we were talking about, and we are looking at the percentage, like the top 20 in terms of the highest percent share, the highest diversity among Black or African American. And if we look at the leftmost columns, we can see those industries that have the highest diversity. One being in transit, as Paul was mentioning from the slide before. And we can see that it's followed by sound recording industries, tire manufacturing, postal services, all the way down to even the major transportation warehousing group, including business support services and rail transportation. Yeah. So yeah, after viewing this, we can also see that this is the top 20 in terms of highest percentage, and this is the bottom 20 that have the lowest share or the least diverse in regard to Black or African American population. The top being florists, and we can see to the rightmost column is also the job count in thousands, or no, this one.
Job count on the right is jobs.
Isn't, yeah, it isn't thousands. Okay. But yeah, moving on to, we can see that especially when looking at, like, as we progress our analysis, especially at the company level, there's great interest on looking at big tech firms in regard to their diversity. And even like seeing here, industries like data processing, hosting, and related services, we can see very low diversity. Even when looking at the EEO forms of places like Apple in terms of like board diversity, for these big tech companies, especially, or companies in general, when battling, not battling, let's not use that word battling, but when looking or analyzing diversity and making a push towards more diverse work environments, especially at the executive level, we're trying to gather as much information as possible as available, and it's not as readily available from EEO, but from analytics using CPS data for various industries. We can get a better idea by overlaying the HIP data that we have, while also looking at the diversity within the industry. So as a final note, it's really promising and good news to see that within greener industries, they are more diverse when looking at the Black or African American population, but also with gender diversity. And it provides us a stepping stone to advance our analytics by now looking at the company level and to see, does that specific company within an industry match the benchmark of diversity reflected by the current population statistics survey.
Great. Amir, thanks for this deep dive into green jobs and into job diversity. To wrap up, greener jobs are more resilient. There were fewer layoffs during COVID. They pay more over time. And it looks like, at least for women and Black and African Americans, they're more diverse as well. So more equitable distribution in society. All right, so that's the introductory portion of today's ESGX. Thanks, Amir, for your monthly analytics. And so now I want to bring to the stage Dr. Fadel Kaboub, who's the professor at Denison University and the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And we have guests Alex Rafalowicz and Claudia Cambrero Arena. And so we're going to talk about everything from eco-failure to what to do, like a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. This takes the inspiration from the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which made the world safer by removing more and more nuclear weapons. We need a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to make the world survivable so that we and biodiversity and nature can actually continue our evolution going forward and not face extinction. So, all right, so Fadel, I'll turn it over to you, and welcome Claudia and Alex.
Thank you. And thank you, Amir, for the presentation. I mean, it's interesting. We're doing this sort of US-focused deep dive over the last couple of years that kind of makes for an interesting transition to what the theme of our conversation is today. We're looking at the US, which is kind of not building back better, but rebuilding back to the older economy, which, as Amir showed us, is extremely extractive. And what we're looking at in terms of green jobs, we're finding it as a non-brainer to transition to a greener, more sustainable economy, because the greener industries, they pay better, they're more diverse, they're more resilient to economic crises, they recovered faster, and yet we're neglecting this wealth of possibilities, and we're building back the same to more extractive industries. So my colleagues and I have participated a couple of weeks ago to Stockholm+50, which is the 50th anniversary of the original Stockholm Conference on the environment that led to the creation of the United Nations Environmental Program, which eventually led to the creation of the IPCC, which now gives us the most important document in terms of scientific research on where we stand in terms of human impact on the environment, and sort of hinting to what needs to be done. And one of the most important reports that came out of the United Nations Environmental Program is a report from 2021 called The Production Gap. And that will segue us into the conversation about why the work on the treaty is so important. The Production Gap report essentially looks at what most, the largest producers of fossil fuel are actually planning to extract and burn, relative to how much we're actually allowed to extract and burn if we're going to have a livable planet by the year 2040. And the gap is essentially showing that we're on track to produce and burn 140% more than what we're allowed to. So UNEP tells us in order to meet the climate challenge, we have to phase out fossil fuels on a rapid scale, not just fossil fuels vaguely speaking, but we're talking about coal, oil, and natural gas. There is no such thing as natural gas being the transition fuel. There is no time to transition. So that's point number one. Point number two, the UNEP report, and you see the production gap here, is also telling us that it doesn't make any sense, scientific sense, any logic to actually keep building more fossil fuel infrastructure right now. So point number one, stop the addition of additional fossil fuel infrastructure. And point number two, phase out fossil fuels on a rapid scale to transition to a greener, healthier, more sustainable system, and to do this with a just transition. Hence the work of the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative and the effort that Alex and Claudia will talk about. So perhaps we should transition to you, Claudia, first to tell us about the work leading up to Stockholm+50. And then Alex will bring you in to tell us about what happened there and what are the next steps for us to work on as a global community. Claudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation today. Well, you've outlined perfectly why we are not on track. We must change what we're doing right now because we have had already 26 COPs, and the climate issue is still not being attended to on the right way, because what we need is to leave the fossil fuels on the ground. So yes, we need to stop exploration, as you just said. We then need to phase out, and we need a just transition. So these are the three pillars of the treaty that we are trying to push countries to make a reality. So the treaty is right now a proposal, an initiative where we tell the countries that you need a roadmap for this, because right now we've got the Paris Agreement, but the Paris Agreement is only talking about reducing emissions and is not directly attacking the problem of fossil fuels. And the fact is it's not working. So that's why we must have a fossil fuel treaty. And what we did as a network, we are really a very big and diverse network of organizations around the world, is we decided that Stockholm+50 was a strategic place to talk about this agenda. We need the UN to be stronger in that conversation of leaving the fossil fuels on the ground. So what's the work that we've been doing, and when I say we, I'm not talking about a secretariat, I'm talking about the full network and all the people engaged in the treaty, is from different constituencies and from different regions pushing this agenda. So for instance, we had a week of action where people called on their governments to bring this agenda to Stockholm. We had Parents for the Future, who were giving a huge call for the love of our children as their campaign and asking to endorse a fossil fuel treaty. And we engaged with the Global Youth Task Force, who was an important group within Stockholm, and they included the treaty on their agenda in a very clear way. So really, there was a huge work, also faith organizations, women's organizations, parliamentarians. We were all working together to speak to different parts of the system about how important it is to have this roadmap to really fast stop exploration, stop making the problem bigger, and plan how to phase out. And this plan to phase out must be just, because we acknowledge that the climate emergency affects in a very different way poor people, people of color, indigenous people, and youth, for instance. They are very strongly affected by this problem that they bear very little responsibility on. So it was really amazing how the network came together, and we had a pre-summit who had a beautiful lineup where you participated, and we had these youth activists expressing with so much strength how we need this fossil fuel. We had indigenous leaders, health professionals, faith leaders. So a huge, huge diversity coming from very different angles of why we need a fossil fuel treaty.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claudia. Alex, the floor is yours. Please share with us your perspective on the treaty work, and where do we go from Stockholm+50, given the declaration that we saw in Sweden a couple of weeks ago?
Thank you, Fidel, and thanks also to the presentation previously, Amir. I think there's economists like to use graphs and lawyers like to use words. So we don't have any images here, but the words we think do matter, and the words fossil fuels, as Claudia has been saying, have not been said at international climate treaties previously. It sounds crazy. It's like one of those things that you can't believe it's true, and like go and get the Paris Agreement, put Control F, and you will not find a reference to fossil fuels. And so what was important about Stockholm+50, although it did not produce a negotiated outcome, it did produce a set of recommendations which represent kind of the best state of agreement between civil society actors, non-state actors, and governments who had been in this process for several months discussing what leadership needed to look like for the next decade. And for the first time, the declaration says, if you'll excuse me reading it, that we need to adopt system-wide change in our current economic system, work to contribute to a healthy planet, and we'll use some ellipses, and arrive at phasing out of fossil fuels while providing targeted support to the poorest and most vulnerable in line with the national circumstances, and recognizing the need for financial and technical support towards a just transition. So these are just words, but they represent a significant change in understanding, I think, globally about the drivers of the climate crisis, and the way that the fossil fuel industry has been set up to continue to extract no matter what the cost to local communities, to ecosystems that they disrupt and transit through, to the communities that have to breathe in the air of contaminated particles and local pollution, and then all of us suffering through the climate crisis today. So it was a significant recommendation, I think, from that conference, and it will be one that we encourage people to take forward with them, whichever walk of life you're in, and an opportunity to engage with decision makers, you can point to it as a guiding principle. And we expect more detailed principles actually to come out in the coming weeks. There was an earlier draft that had been circulated that had even more detail on what needed to be done around fossil fuels. It was quite, I think, good recognition at the highest level that we've been silent on the fossil fuel system for too long. To be blunt, we bought into a form of policy making that was predicated on the market, right? We believed that the market signal at the end of the tailpipe would let us know that we needed to scale down extracting fossil fuels. And my guess is that your listeners and folks watching here are aware that the market has historically and terrifically and terribly failed when it comes to climate change, and that the market signals that we could send at this point will not be sufficient to change the direction of travel of the most powerful industry in the history of humanity. And if we're going to change the most powerful industry in the history of humanity, we're going to have to do it collectively. We're going to have to assert our shared sovereignty, and we're going to have to say, we don't want this to happen anymore. We're going to change our model of production and consumption. And that's really what the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative is about. It's about getting out and clearly articulating, like was mentioned in the introduction, that fossil fuels are equivalent to nuclear weapons in terms of the risk they present to us existentially, and therefore we need global cooperation to work together to phase them out. And so the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative works to push that idea at international forums, at national governments, and we also draw in local governments. There are over 50, I think there are 54 now, cities or municipal or subnational governments who have endorsed the idea of a fossil fuel treaty. And now we're trying to work with them to look at what does phasing out fossil fuel extraction in their jurisdictions look like, and how do they contribute to the changing norm that says, okay, you want to be a climate leader, you want to care about the climate emergency, you want to take climate action, you care about climate justice. All of these things lead to dealing with the production of fossil fuels.
Thank you, Alex. If I may pick on one of the statements you made earlier, and that came out of the Stockholm+50 declaration, which is systematic change is needed, and the need for collaboration. And the interesting thing that I've observed about the coalition behind the fossil fuel treaty is that it's that kind of collaboration from people from all kinds of different backgrounds, finally recognizing that the culmination of all of our individual efforts, say on the waterfront, on the social justice front, on the indigenous rights fronts, on human rights, on safety, on climate, they all culminate under this big umbrella that is tackling the biggest elephant in the room, that has been in the room for a long time and never been named in these climate negotiations. So Claudia, if I may bring the conversation to you, if you could share with us how your work and activism prior to joining the treaty initiative kind of led you in this journey to focusing on fossil fuels, and why it's so important to end fossil fuels.
Yes, well, I've been really lucky. I think I've been in the right place at the right time. And so back in 2006, there was a World Water Forum being organized in Mexico City. And this was a corporate thing that was coming to Mexico City. And I was in the middle of it all, organizing with many people, NGOs, peasants, anti-free trade organization, feminists, and so on, trying to fight this corporate grab of water that was already happening in Mexico by then. And at the same time, this allowed me to be in communication and collaboration with organizations from all over the world. And that just sent me towards networking. And I've been working in networking all my life, trying to connect, bridge people, trying to find the ways that they can have better support for important environmental causes. And then when fracking started to be a big concern in Mexico, I started to learn about fossil fuels. And what I learned was that it was a bit of a lonely struggle. Like there were many, people that had fought small projects, but there wasn't really organizing against fossil fuels, and that surprised me, because when we got started, we said, well, we're going to find partners that have experience and have been doing this for a while, and that was not the case. And so it meant a huge learning curve, and but it was also amazing because it drew people together from very diverse backgrounds and concerns. And then when we started to talk about, for me, when I started, it was about water, but then I started to learn about the climate implications and started to learn about climate change. And this was back in 2018 when this nightmare report came out about what the world with 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or more would look like. And it was very scary, and it was a wake-up call for me. And so I afterwards found the Fossil Fuel Treaty and was lucky enough to get a job with it. And what I've learned here is even more diversity from, as you've said, people coming from very different angles to the struggle. And that's really very inspiring, but also really helpful because it allows you to get to more people. And we know that all our society depends on fossil fuels. What we have right now, everything is related to fossil fuels. So leaving them in the ground and thinking of a different way of living is really uncomfortable. And it won't happen easily with our politicians. So we must have huge numbers, because when you're asking for something that not necessarily sounds popular at the start, then you really need to build the pressure. And of course, you've got the corporate interests there that are really very clever and always present in different ways to keep on their agenda. So yes, this possibility of bringing people from all different backgrounds, from very different countries, understanding the huge importance of the Pacific Islands. Like many people in the world will not even know where they are, what their names are. And it's really inspiring what they've done for the climate movement. And I had this privilege of listening to this young climate warriors. They're just so inspiring, so amazing. And they are facing a very, very serious threat to their future. Their countries could disappear. So that is one of the clearest expression of how this is not fair. It is not fair that countries that do not bear the responsibility, have not created the problem, could disappear. That's just outrageous. And so having them in this leadership and towards pushing for a fossil fuel treaty is really very important, because their voice is so significant to what we're facing in this humanitarian crisis.
Absolutely, and one of the things that I really admire in the treaty work is the focus on a just transition for countries in the global south that did not bear the responsibility for emissions since the Industrial Revolution, and yet faced the more severe consequences, either directly in terms of climate damage or indirectly in terms of phasing out fossil fuels and transforming the economy for countries that depend heavily on not only just exports of fossil fuels, but also use of fossil fuels for traditional economic activity in the traditional economic development model. So focusing our attention on, imagining that better, more sustainable, more resilient world requires structural transformation in terms of changing the engine of economic development. And this is kind of where my work comes in, and my passion for this work comes in, which is, number one, to highlight that the existing engines of economic development are neocolonial and extractive to begin with. And they, on top of it, rely on fossil fuels. I'll give you an example. Countries that say we need to have more tourism because tourism is the engine of economic development and economic growth. But what you don't recognize is that most countries that don't have food sovereignty or energy sovereignty in the global south, the more tourism you bring in, the more fuel you have to bring in to heat and cool the hotels, to transport tourists, the more food you have to import. And all of that is extractive to the industry, to the economy, because it ends up with more trade deficit, with more pressure on their exchange rate, which means with more inflation that is imported via food and fuel imports. So if you take the tourism industry in country X and say, we're going to make your energy system more sovereign based on renewable energy infrastructure, then at that point, tourism becomes a net benefit, not extractive. So if you invest in food sovereignty, renewable energy sovereignty, then tourism is great because you bring net benefits to the economy and it's sustainable and it's resilient. But the fossil fuel economy that we have is by design extractive of the most vulnerable countries on the planet, mostly in the global south. And it explains the massive external debt that developing countries have to this day. If you net out global financial transactions between rich and poor countries, including trade and interest payments and charity and remittances, we have $2 trillion moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries. That's the neocolonial extractive international trade and finance architecture that we need to undo. And undoing it requires structural transformation in the way we organize international trade and the way we produce things, which means the energy source is extremely important, because you can't have a functioning economy without energy, right? And we're not saying we want to go back to the dark ages with no energy. We want to sustain higher quality of life and sustainable, high quality of life for all, not just for some. And that requires transformation of the energy system. And fossil fuels are at the heart of undoing the old extractive system. So with that, Alex, can you tell us a little bit about the large coalition that the fossil fuel treaty team has gathered from faith leaders and Nobel laureates and diplomats from around the world, and where should we be concentrating our efforts as a movement in the lead up to COP27 and beyond?
Thank you, Fidel. So the movement for a fossil fuel treaty is open to everyone. And anyone. It's, we try and develop materials that help anyone that gets inspired by the idea to do it. I got inspired by the idea because I'd been working with a great organization called 350.org, which worked on divestment campaigns and worked on frontline resistance to fossil fuel project campaigns, and worked on linking the money to the projects. And that work is so essential to stopping the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. And I felt like we were just kind of playing whack-a-mole, like there was just always a new project, there was always a new bank, there was always a new thing. And we needed to have a demand that also went to our governments and went to the scale of the problem and said, we got a global scale problem. We need a global scale solution. We can come together and do it. So that's what drew me into the treaty. And so we're seeing faith leaders come in and make the moral case for that. The Dalai Lama has endorsed the pillars of the treaty and called for that cooperation. Over 100 Nobel laureates have done it. Over 3,000 scientists, including NASA and academics and climate scientists from across the world. The cities have come in and made the call. Actually, several thousand of the leadership of the Fridays for Future movement, the youth movement have made the call as part of their vision for intergenerational equity. There are development organizations, the people who care about what we call the Sustainable Development Goals, our vision for a sustainable development model, or maybe reject that model, but want to see a different way of developing. They're behind this idea because they see climate change and the fossil fuel system as the biggest risk to that development. There are human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, that have come on board supporting the idea because they see how the fossil fuel system contributes to local human rights abuses and that climate change systematically undermines human rights. There are a lot of medical organizations, Doctors Healthcare Without Harm, that can see the link between local pollution, climate change, and the fossil fuel system, and want there to be a global response to draw down production. And then, I should have really mentioned first, but Indigenous peoples, there are many Indigenous people organizations that have endorsed the idea of a treaty, asserting their sovereignty over the lands that they have been the traditional owners of, and wanting to push for a decolonized view on how we should approach it. Not just what, the economy, and I understand the economy is an important way of talking about things, but of society and of community, about how we relate to each other and how we relate to nature. And there are now increasingly trade unions as well, who recognize climate change is one of the biggest threats to working people. It's one of the biggest injustices happening in our world. And we're going to need to build much more solidarity and resilience in our societies with social protections, with support for working people, if we're going to get through the climate crisis. And so they can see why we need a fossil fuel treaty as well. So as we head into COP27, there'll be several opportunities, I think, to call for a fossil fuel treaty and for a focus on fossil fuels wherever you are. There is, of course, every country is looking at its national contribution to the UN Climate Convention, and we would encourage every country to reference their plans on fossil fuel production and their plans to resource a just transition. We'll be launching in September around the UN General Assembly the first ever global registry of fossil fuel production that'll be searchable and publicly available. You mentioned the UNEP and SEI's production gap report, an absolutely pivotal and important document, but it provides an overview summary. The data inside it's not searchable, and we're going to, with our partners at Carbon Tracker and Global Energy Monitor, they're building a portal and interface for folks to be able to do that. So there'll be that opportunity. And we would like to see, for the first time, the UN Climate Conference have a focused discussion about fossil fuels. In the last days in Glasgow, there was a little bit of discussion about it, and it ended with a very weak wording that talked about unabated coal-fired power, needing to phase down unabated coal-fired power. We absolutely need to phase out coal-fired power. The word unabated is a loophole that you can drive a coal train through because it's an excuse for governments to give money to the failed CCS technology. And we need to go beyond thinking just about the power. We need to think about how do we address reliance on production and extraction as parts of our economic structures. So I might segue into what's happening here in Colombia, if I may.
Yes, absolutely. Please.
in Bogota in Colombia, and there's been a historic victory on the weekend. For the first time, a leftist and a clear leftist candidate won the presidency of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, and his vice president, Francia Marquez, is the first Afro-Colombian to be vice president. She is also a long-time social community leader, anti-extractivist activist. She's a mother, and she brings, I think she won the Goldman Prize, which is like the Nobel Prize for the environment. She's a truly inspiring leader with a commitment to anti-extractivism. So to say that, a leftist won an election in Latin America, people might be like, oh, well, we've seen that script before from 15 years ago. A bit like Boric in Chile, but different. Petro is the first leftist who is absolutely, clearly, and unimpeachably anti-extractivist. And it is central to his political identity. It is central to all of his speeches. It's central to what he's talked about. It's not something he hides from. When he was asked by the biggest newspaper, on August 7, when you get inaugurated, what will be your first act? And he said, it will be stopping the issuing of any new licenses for exploration of oil. So he really sees the climate crisis as an existential challenge, which it is, and he's prepared to put Colombia and the government of Colombia and the people of Colombia as leaders on the struggle against climate change and for climate justice. So it's a very exciting time. There is, I'll share the link. There's an excerpt from his victory speech available here there's some subtitles into English, where he very clearly says that the extraction of coal, oil, and gas cannot be the basis for social justice, for economic redistribution, or for the wealth of a country, and that they risk our future prosperity, and we need to have a different model that's not an extractivist model. So that type of leadership, he also proposed, a summit of all of the Americas, not just some of the Americas, but all of the Americas, to come together to talk about a continental approach to climate, to extraction, and to save the Amazon. So I would encourage folks who are listening to read up on what's happened in Colombia and offer your support. He's already being attacked by vested interests for his proposals, and so it does make a difference when you voice that you're inspired by something, that you let people know that there is a leader there that should be listened to. It can make a difference. So welcome that from you and from any of the listeners.
Thank you, Alex. Wonderful. And you've heard me say this probably in Stockholm, which is two things. One is that, as you said, you can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been decolonized yet, structurally decolonized. And that's on the economic front, on the decolonizing the thinking, also the mind, but also on what you just said on Petro's victory and on his commitment to ending extractivism, especially on the fossil fuel front. I said this before. I mean, it's one of two things for the leaders who continue to build more fossil fuel infrastructure today. It's one of two things. They're either signing our collective suicide pact, because the science is very clear about what that means, or they're producing stranded assets and selling them to pension funds and the university endowments all over the world with the understanding that those will become stranded assets worth nothing, which is financial fraud if you're doing this intentionally. So whether it's collective suicide pact or financial fraud, it's criminal, and it should be treated as such. And what Petro announced the other day, that his commitment of his administration is probably the first world leader to actually take a turn on fossil fuels, with not just on the moral front, but also understanding the economics of transitioning away from extractive industries. Because if extractive industries were the way to prosperity, so many other countries would be wealthier and more prosperous than Switzerland today. recognizing that this is a false hope, that these are traps on the economic front in causing so much climate damage is a step in the right direction. Nigel, if you're with us still, I'd like to bring you in to comment a little bit on your work in terms of, I've heard you say this so many times, in terms of the importance of strategic investments. And maybe you can refer to some examples of your work in Australia as well. So Nigel, the floor is yours.
Absolutely, Fadl. And I think it's incredibly important. There are, of course, many challenges we have to grapple with, as Alex and Claudia have been talking about, but they are also in many cases huge opportunities too. So Australia is a case in point, and another country that's just had an election and has just seen a change of government too. And Australia has for a long time been a high income economy. It's been very successful, but fixed capital formation has completely collapsed over the last decade because there's been so much focus on the past, and what is desperately needed is investment in the future, and that is investment in renewable energy, in things like the bioeconomy, perhaps developing a sustainable aviation fuel sector there where there's plenty of space to grow the crops, building some new transport infrastructure. It has, I think, the busiest overland air route in the world that doesn't have high-speed rail. There's endless opportunities for investment. And a lot of this investment is just really attractive from an investor's point of view. They are long-run projects with relatively predictable returns. And indeed, many of them are also an answer to some of the challenges and problems we face today in terms of high energy costs. If Australia had invested proactively in renewable energy over the last decade in a way that has been hugely held back by government policy for the last 9 years or so, many of the challenges that it's facing today in power prices simply wouldn't be there. And for a big part of that time, certainly since about 2015, renewables have just been thoroughly economic. They've been cheaper than the alternative. And despite that political pressure not to invest, there still has been significant investment. It's one of the more progressed countries on this pathway, but there's way more to be done. And then I think the other part of this opportunity, and this goes to the points that I think everyone has rightly been making about the need to support inclusive development, in Australia's case, around the region. I think there are lots of great practical opportunities to provide support for the transition of regional economies with Pacific Island nations to renewable energy, where in most cases they're decommissioning diesel, which is horribly polluting and crazily expensive. So there's a wonderful virtuous circle to be pursued.
Thank you, Nigel. We're 2 minutes to the top of the hour, so this is a good moment to wrap up the conversation with some closing comments, thoughts, where people can find more about your work and kind of words of encouragement to our movement to keep pushing to COP27 and beyond. Alex, if you don't mind, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Fadel. Yeah, please check out fossilfueltreaty.org. And there's a lot of materials there that can help you start a campaign where you are, or convince someone else to sign on. We're at risk of tipping points in the climate system that are going to, accelerate the change that we're experiencing, and they're very scary. But equally, social tipping points should give us equal amounts of hope. The change happens much faster than we can expect, and when you're doing the work, it feels like it's a constant labor, and it is. It's going to be the struggle of our lifetimes. But the changes are going to come, and you can see, in Colombia for the first time in 215 years, a leftist government, and one elected profoundly committed to anti-extractivism. So change can happen, and I wish you well making it.
Thank you. Claudia, the floor is yours with some closing thoughts.
Yes, as well as inviting people to our webpage, inviting you to our social media. We have great colleagues with communications and so many good materials that you'll find there, and a lot of inspiration, actually. So yes, we're not on track. We are really at a point that we need to build the pressure on our governments. Every level of government matters. If you can speak to a parliamentarian, speak to a parliamentarian. If you can speak to a municipality, do so. And if you can access your national government also, because we need all the strength that we can get, but also talk to your neighbor. And let's just make this conversation the regular thing, because we must understand that fossil fuels are not a development tool. They are taking us in the wrong direction, and we must just make this path towards leaving them in the ground and transitioning to a just world. And that just world can have many different ways of looking, and please join in building that.
Thank you, Claudia. And I'll just close in saying that this movement and this effort is really about informing, educating, and mobilizing people to apply that pressure. And a lot of it starts with informing, because our neighbors have been told, have been convinced that if we transition out of fossil fuels, you'll be back in the dark ages and your job will disappear. And all of these false, statements and all of these false solutions that are presented to the public is really what's holding us back. But those conversations to inform, empower, and mobilize people is really what's going to create that tipping point for this movement and for a better and more just transition. So Nigel and Paul, I'll hand it over to you to close this event. Thank you again for hosting us.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Claudia. Thanks, Alex.
So much.
Really appreciate the thoughtful deeper dive. Please go to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, sign it yourself, ask your employer to sign it, spread it around your networks. The Nuclear Weapons Non-Proliferation Treaty made us safer, and the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty will enable us to survive. Next time on ESGX, Nigel, do you have a proposed next steps?
Well, we're heading into our summer break, so we very much welcome suggestions as we put together our program for the fall of topics to cover, people you would love us to have on. Please let us know. We'll email you with some details over the coming days. You can just respond to that or send suggestions to info@esgx.org. And from me, a closing comment is absolutely to pick up on this point that social change and revolutionary social change can happen more quickly than you expect. The Australian Parliament now has 10 candidates in it that have been selected by their communities and not by political parties. There's 10 out of 150 seats, and those candidates all are there on a platform for strong action on climate change. And they bring a whole new dynamic to the political landscape in Australia, which will not go away. I'm very, very convinced that at the next election in 3 years' time, we will see even more of those candidates elected, and they will likely hold the balance of power in Australian politics. And to put this into context, that election has already started. One of the independent candidates for the 2025 elections has already come forward, having very nearly displaced one of the government ministers from the last government who has one of the safest seats in the country. So Nick Bowl is here for 2025. So this is, I think it's really encouraging, particularly for anybody who's staring out at some of the madness going on around the world and finding it depressing. There is hope in community action and in collaboration. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.